Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ba'd. So, continuing from where we left off yesterday, regarding the divine law and those laws which are a demand, we discussed the obligatory. Does anybody remember some aspects of what we discussed? The definition. What is the definition of wajib? Compulsory, yes. English translation. What does it exactly mean? Right. And that's partial definition. Can we write it down? Right. It's that demand of the Sharia, which, as you mentioned, if we fulfill, we receive a reward. However, what we mentioned was that if you forsake it, not that you receive punishment, but you're under the threat of punishment. Remember, that was a very important thing I wanted to stress yesterday. I don't know if I stressed it well enough. In the sense that when a person forsakes an act which is wajib and therefore commits a sin, that sinfulness does not necessitate that he will be punished by Allah, but rather, as the verse in Surah An-Nisa mentions, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could either forgive him for that sin, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could punish him. Right? So therefore, when we say that the act of wajib is that demand of the Sharia, that absolute demand of the Sharia, or we said the absolute demand of the Sharia, which wants us to comply to that demand, if we do it, then therefore we will be rewarded, but if we forsake it, we are under the threat of punishment. Alright? So make sure you always remember that word, threat. Okay, that's just quickly remember the definition of Sharia law. Sharia law is a divine address, or the address of the lawgiver, that pertains to the acts of those morally obligated, and consists of a demand, an option, or a declaration. And we're still continuing with the demands. And we said regarding the demands that a demand was two types: an act of commission, which is either absolute, which is the obligatory, the wajib, or a recommended act of commission, which is the mandub, which we'll be discussing right now, and then we'll discuss the other categories thereafter. So those acts of commission, as we said, were absolute demands to do something, absolute or recommended. And the recommended is known as mandub. And so therefore, we can make the definition of the mandub as that recommended demand of the Sharia, okay? The recommended demand of the Sharia, which, if we comply to it, we will be rewarded, but if we fail to comply to it, we will not be under the threat of punishment. Alright, so the difference between them, therefore, the mandub and the wajib is in what aspects? Looking at the two definitions. Yes, brother?
Yeah, on the mandub, if you do it, you get rewards, but when you leave it, there's no punishment. But with the wajib, if you leave it, you're under the threat of punishment.
Right, and so therefore the demand is, that's exactly right, so therefore the demand is recommended, okay, as opposed to the demand of the wajib, which is absolute. You must comply to it. All right, mandub, but for those who write Arabic and want to know how to write it is like this. Mandub. Now, there are a number of similar terms to mandub, which are used by the scholars. Among which is nafil, among which is sunnah, among which is mustahab, these are some of the terms. There are other terms used by the scholars. Now, what we should understand is that just as the obligatory acts we mentioned were of different degrees of obligation, in other words, the acts which Allah has obligated upon us are of different degrees and whereby which we must comply. Some are of the utmost obligation. There are others which we must comply to but are not of the same degree of obligation. Likewise, the recommended acts of the Sharia, the mandub, are also of different degrees. And what you'll find is that the scholars in the different legal schools, the different madahib, will use these terms in different ways to indicate different degrees of recommended acts. Alright, so for some, and I'm not going to go into different terms because it would be just, it would take the whole course just to take them all. But like for some they would put maybe 4 terms, some would use 3 terms. Some would use 1 term to indicate a greater degree of the act being recommended, while others would use another term. Because these are conventions used by the scholars. And since they are conventions, they are technical terms, then therefore there is no harm in using any type of convention you would like, so long as the meaning is understood. And so when one is reading a legal work written by any scholar or any school of law, one would have to know how they employ these terms to then understand when they describe a certain act of the Sharia being recommended, to what degree is it recommended. This is something which is important. But for the purposes of this introductory course, what is necessary is that we understand that these are just other terms which are used like the term mandub, sometimes mustahab, sometimes sunnah, sometimes nafil, and so forth. But in general, what I'd like to do is we can say that the recommended act, we're just going to, for the purposes of this course, divide the recommended act into 2 categories. And this is just a sort of general division. It doesn't really comply to any legal school, but it's a useful way to conceptualize the subject. That is, we can divide the recommended into what is known as the sunnah mu'akkada, and then of course the sunnah ghayr mu'akkada, the sunnah mu'akkada refers to that recommended act of the Sharia which the Prophet ﷺ would constantly do, would hardly ever forsake. And so therefore the word mu'akkada in the Arabic language linguistically can be maybe translated as emphasized. So it is a recommended act which has been emphasized by the Prophet ﷺ, in that he would hardly ever forsake it. A good example would be the 2 rak'ahs that one prays before Salatul Fajr. It was the practice of our Prophet ﷺ to pray those 2 rak'ahs, whether he was a resident or whether he was traveling. He would never forsake those 2 rak'ahs before the Salatul Fajr. Another type of sunnah is the sunnah ghayr mu'akkada, which would be that practice which is recommended. However, the Prophet ﷺ did not emphasize it, and so therefore it was not practiced constantly. An example would be the 2 rak'ahs that is prayed before the Maghrib prayer. It is mentioned in some of the hadith statements of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said there are 2 rak'ahs to be prayed between the adhan and the iqamah. Literally the hadith says between the 2 adhans, but the understanding is between the adhan and the iqamah. And he repeated that statement thrice, 3 times, and then he said, liman yasha, for whoever wants to do that. And it was for that reason that some of the Prophet's companions would pray 2 rak'ahs before the Maghrib prayer, and others would not pray the 2 rak'ahs prior to the Maghrib prayer. And we know from the practice of the Prophet ﷺ himself that he would not pray the 2 rak'ahs prior to the Maghrib prayer. So while his sunnah permits a praying of 2 rak'ahs prior to the Maghrib prayer, he did not emphasize that. He allowed it through his statement, but he did not emphasize that through his deed. And so therefore that would be classified as a sunnah غير مؤكدة, a sunnah which was not emphasized by him, as opposed to the 2 rak'ahs before Salat al-Fajr, which would be a sunnah mu'akkada. Now, okay, so that is, as I mentioned, a very simple way to classify the recommended acts. As I mentioned previously, the scholars, the different legal schools, and also in their various writings, will give different degrees, and they differ sometimes between legal school to the other, or between author and another, regarding on how to classify the recommended acts. And when whatever reads a work on fiqh, it's important that he understands the style of writing that the author or the school employs. We have one other matter regarding the recommended that I wanted to touch on. Let me find my notes here. And that is, what are some of the important aspects, or what is some of the significance, let's say the significance, what is the significance of the recommended act in the Sharia? Let's list some of the significance. I mean, somebody might adopt the attitude, well, since the recommended act is such that if I forsake it, I will not I will not be under the threat of punishment, and so therefore, what's the big deal? Why should I be concerned with this? And let's mention 3 matters. The first matter is that Allah has made the recommended acts a type of shield for the obligatory. In some of the statements of the Prophet ﷺ, he explained that every servant of Allah has a period of waning off. In other words, all of us, at one point in our life, we will experience a time when our acts of worship will decrease, will decline, there will be a waning of those acts. And then he says, he whose, when he's in that period, his waning of his acts puts him within his sunnah, he will succeed. But he who, when his waning of his acts results him in falling outside of the Prophet's sunnah, he will be destroyed. And so therefore we might imagine, let's use this side of the board. Therefore we might imagine that this would be the recommended. Let us use the Arabic term, the mandu. And this would be the obligatory, or the wajib. Obligatory. Okay, so when a person in his behavior and conduct is constantly trying to fall within the recommended acts, and then he has that period of waning off, which everyone will experience at one time or the other, what will happen is that he will start neglecting some of these recommended acts. And at the worst, he would find himself in the obligatory. Okay? And so therefore, he will not be under the threat of punishment because he has not sinned. But when an individual is only sticking to the obligatory acts, and then that period comes in his life where he starts having that decrease in his acts of worship, what will happen is he'll start neglecting some of these obligatory acts. And so therefore he will result in sinning. And so he'll be under the threat of punishment. And therefore he'll lead himself perhaps to destruction if he never comes out of that. And so therefore, even though the recommended is something which is just that, recommended, it does have the benefit of being a shield that protects us so that when we have weakness in our faith, because Iman, as we know, increases with good deeds and also decreases or diminishes with acts of sinfulness, it protects us from falling off the straight path. And of course, if a person has much recommended deeds and he decreases, he might still even be within the realm of the recommended if he does a lot of the recommended. The second matter is that the recommended, second significance is that it completes the obligatory. There is a Qudsi hadith, and a Qudsi hadith is one in which the Prophet ﷺ quotes Allah Azza wa Jal, where Allah, our Lord, says that the first matter which He will judge His servant by is the prayer. And if the prayer is complete, in other words, if all the obligatory prayers have been fulfilled, Allah will then judge the other acts. However, though, if the obligatory prayers are incomplete, Allah will say, look and see if my servant had any voluntary acts of prayer. Okay? So what happens here is that on the Day of Judgment, when a person has not done all his obligatory prayers, or some of his obligatory prayers were not accepted by Allah, then his recommended prayers or his voluntary acts of worship will complete these obligatory acts. And so therefore, the more voluntary or recommended acts of worship a person does, whether it pertains to the prayer or the fast or else or otherwise, will complete what is not accepted or what was missing from the obligatory acts of worship. Yes?
You just mentioned other recommended acts of worship, but just to clarify, I think it's one of the dignitary prayers I find acceptable. Is it just the prayers that Allah will look at, or is there other acts of worship as well? Because you said that you look at the celebration and that was prayer. Is it just the prayer that
Well, that's how, the understanding that some scholars have understood from the hadith is that once the prayers have been judged, then the other acts of worship will be judged, likewise. So then it would go to the fasting, and Allah will see if the person's done all his completed fasts. And then if there's some days which were not accepted by Allah, they would look to see if he has any additional fasts and so forth. That's not mentioned maybe in the wording of the hadith, but the scholars have understood that the example of the prayer was because it is the most important act of worship, and that by extension, the judgment would apply for the other acts of worship. The third aspect is that, or the third significance for these recommended acts is that it draws us closer to Allah. In that, there is another Qudsi hadith whereby which Allah Azza wa Jal says that that a servant draws closest to Allah through the obligatory, or that a servant draws, what Allah loves most from a servant is the obligatory acts. And that the servant continues to draw closer to Allah by the voluntary or the recommended acts until Allah loves him. So, when one does these recommended acts of worship, one draws closer to Allah until Allah loves that individual. And so therefore, among the significance of the voluntary acts is that it draws us closer to Allah until Allah loves us. Yes, brother? You can ask your teacher in Aqidah, shall I say? Because we don't want to go off, but if you need it after class, maybe I can ask it for you. Now, the voluntary, also we should understand that knowledge of the voluntary, okay, so this is a different thing. It's not the actual fulfilling of the voluntary acts, but knowledge of the voluntary is an obligation upon the community, so that none of the religion would be lost. In other words, the Muslims as a whole have to be aware of which acts are voluntary acts, so therefore none of the religion would be lost. Okay? Even though it's not required upon them to apply these voluntary acts. But knowledge of the voluntary is an obligation upon the community. What was the Arabic term for obligation of the community? Huh? Farduran al-Kifaya, right. Okay. Don't get scared. Alright. So that's basically what I wanted to mention about the mandub, the recommended acts. Are there any questions regarding the mandub? Yes, brother.
Can you just explain to me? You said we need knowledge of the voluntary. Where was this line with regards to the person who gains knowledge of the voluntary?
No, we said that the community, the Muslims as a whole, need to know what the voluntary acts, so that none of the religion would be lost.
Not individually.
Yeah, not individually. No. Yes, brother.
In completing the obligatory, I think many of the, speaking for myself, many of the reverts that come to Islam did things improperly in the beginning, whether it was praying without wudu or whatever, conditions which, now that we're educated, we know would make our prayers valid. Is it incumbent upon us to go back and repeat those prayers, though we had insufficient knowledge?
No, unless you are within the prayer time itself. For instance, let us say somebody enters into the religion of Islam at, let's say Zuhr is around 12 o'clock here in London, and he prays without wudu, and at 1:30, before the Asr prayer, he understands that he needed ablution to pray. Since that obligation, the time for that obligation still remains, he would need to do the prayer. But let's say he had entered into the Asr prayer, the afternoon prayer, and since that time has finished, then that prayer would not be held for him to pray, and it would be accepted by Allah as he did it.
So this is even if, for example, we were advised to pray 5 times a day, we were praying 5 times a day, but all at the same time, not knowing that we had to pray within specific windows, etc.
Right, the same, it would be that. Unless one knew that he had to pray at different times during that same very day, then those prayers would
not act on the time.
Right. Exactly. Okay, let's now take the other aspect of the demand, and those are the acts of omission. In other words, things we are required to leave. Okay? When you omit something, it means that you leave it, right? You do not perform it. And again, they are two types: the absolute, something that we're required to leave, and also things which are recommended. REC means recommended. You've had enough room in the slide to write about that. Okay, so let's take those two. The act which is an absolute demand by the Sharia to forsake is known as haram. Which is sometimes translated, I guess, as forbidden. And it is the exact opposite of the obligatory. In that, when you leave it, when you forsake it, when you do not do it, you receive, okay, so to leave it, you receive a reward, and if you commit it, you are under the threat of punishment. You have sinned. So it's the exact opposite of the wajib, the obligatory. Something which is forbidden. Let's give an example. I'm sure we know something. Yes?
When you say you reward for leaving it, that's the contrary.
It will come to that in a second. But let's first give an example of zina. Okay. What else? Kamar. Okay. Anything else? Tanzir. Okay. Let's look at something that is more likely for people to fall into. Lying. Okay. Good. So lying or cheating or deceiving. These are all sins, right? These are all things which are forbidden. Just like zina and intoxicants or eating the flesh of swine is also a sin. So to leave it, okay, to leave these forbidden acts, one receives a reward. But as the brother asked in his question, is that it has to be left consciously, in other words, with an intention. I mean, one cannot just leave it because he just didn't come across it, but if he had the opportunity to come across it, he would indulge in it. That's not the aim. But the idea is to consciously leave it. Out of volition, out of intent, you would receive a reward from Allah. And however, if you committed, you have sinned, and so therefore you're under the threat of punishment by Allah. And regarding the forbidden, we want to discuss some of the aspects. One aspect is that can something be, an issue which you should understand, can something be at the same time obligatory and haram at the same time? Huh? No? Somebody should say yes, because this is how it normally ends up. Okay, yes, all right. It depends on how you look at it. So. I'm going to use some terms which are just sort of okay, if we say that the highest category is something called the genus, okay, and then this would have, let's say, a species, and this would be the individual. Okay, so let's say a genus would be like an animal, all right, and one type would be a camel, and another type a pig. Okay. You could say that in one aspect that there are animals which are lawful, like camels, to consume, and animals which are unlawful, haram, to consume, like the pig, okay? And likewise, if we use another example, like an act of worship, if we said this was the highest category, and we said that among the acts of worship, for instance, would be like bowing, and another would be prostration. Okay? And we come down to the individual types of prostrations, to Allah and to an idol. You could have a prostration, which is, if you look at it from this level, the prostration, you could say there's a lawful prostration, or an obligatory prostration to Allah, and a forbidden prostration to an idol. But the point is, when you come down to the lowest possible way of dividing or describing an act, it can never be both obligatory and forbidden at the same time. Okay? Did I completely confuse? Alright. So the point is that when you come to the final way of classifying something, right, the lowest common denominator, let's say, of an act or an object, it cannot be both obligatory and forbidden. It cannot be both lawful and prohibited. That's an impossibility. However, though, if you look at it from the aspect of some of the general categories which those acts fall under, then it can be. Like we can take animals. There are some animals which are lawful to consume, like camels and cows and sheep, and other animals which are forbidden to consume, like pigs and cats and dogs. There are some acts of worship which are permitted acts of worship, which are obligatory, like prostration to Allah, but there are other acts of worship which are forbidden, like to prostrate to an idol. Yes? No, but this is because of the circumstance. We're talking about the act itself, in terms of this, how it's being legislated. I think that's what they're looking at. All right, now we want to look at the different categories of something which is forbidden. I mean, why does Allah forbid something? We can divide that into about 3 categories. Let's take that. We're coming close to the class end, coming to each other. All right, so this is the categories of prohibition. All right, sometimes an act is forbidden or prohibited due to a quality or an attribute in itself. Sometimes an act is forbidden due to sometimes an act is forbidden due to itself. Sorry about that. Due to itself, and sometimes due to a quality or an attribute in itself, and sometimes an act is forbidden in reference to something else, and that reference to something else is divided into 2 categories as inseparable to the act and separable to the act. Yeah, I will. I'll give you some examples. An act which is forbidden due to itself. In other words, the action, no matter how you look at that act, or the object, if it's an object, from any aspect, it is forbidden. There is nothing lawful in it whatsoever. In other words, it is, in its essence, fully, 100% fully, corruption. There is nothing good in it. An example would be shirk. To worship others with Allah. Okay? In other words, when the scholars look at the act of shirk, they see that shirk in and of itself is the reason why it is forbidden. Another example given by the scholars is zina, or illicit sex. The Arabic language, zina, can be used for both fornication and adultery. But in English, you don't have just a general term, so I guess illicit sex sort of, explains that. So these acts, for example, the scholars have seen that it is forbidden because itself, in its essence, it is what the quality is forbidden. And so therefore, under no circumstances would these acts become permissible. Even under duress, even under, when you're under, necessity, these acts can never become lawful. Yes, brother.
That's obviously because the evidence was where, I can't remember the name of Sahaba, he had to make a statement that showed he didn't do it at the start, so,
Yeah, he didn't do it at his heart, right?
So to do it at the heart, obviously.
And the Sharia would never allow at any time give permission for somebody to do an act of shirk. I mean, it was the aim of doing shirk, not in the time when he just said it in order to protect himself. I mean, that statement was a false statement. He didn't actually commit shirk in his heart. And likewise, zina. The Sharia never, under any circumstance, would allow a person to do zina. All right. An act which is forbidden due to a quality in itself would be khamar, right? Khamar, which is a broad term which would mean intoxicating drinks. So wine, beer, whatever. When looking at the reason why Allah forbade khamar, the scholars deduce that it is due to the quality of the loss of the ability to reason by those who, or the intoxicating quality by those who drink this substance. It results in their losing their ability, their faculties to reason. Is an intoxicant. However, though, there are times when the Sharia would permit the use of khamar to be consumed. An example is if somebody is choking and there's no way to dislodge, let's say, what is in his throat, except if he was to take a sip or a drink or some sort of intoxicant. That's the only thing on hand. That between that and his death, then it becomes permissible. Yes? To consume khamar for medical reasons? No, because the Prophet ﷺ informed that there is nothing in which Allah has forbidden having some sort of cure. And so therefore, the idea that khamar would be a cure, having some sort of curative qualities, it would seem that this hadith negates. Some other scholars have said that perhaps that the effects, I mean, even if there's a curative quality in the alcohol, but that the other effects, the harmful effects, would mask that curative quality, and so therefore the overall harm to the body would be greater. All right, an act which is forbidden in reference to something else. An example, and that can be either, that act which is in reference to something else can either be inseparable of that act. In other words, that act cannot be performed without that matter, or it is separable to that act. An example of something inseparable to the act, and the example is weak, I admit, but this is what they use, is to pray on land illegally seized. So let's say there's a piece of land where you do your prayers on, right? Okay, that land is illegally seized. Okay, they see that as being inseparable to the act of worship, in that no matter how you do the prayer, you're always going to be praying on that land, so therefore it's inseparable to it. And I admit this is a weak example, but that's what I found in the books. So.
Make that a little clearer.
Okay, land, right? That you've illegally seized. You wrested from somebody by force. Okay, or you have perhaps swindled somebody, right, to take his parcel of land from him. And yet you're a Muslim, so you do your prayers, right, on that land that you have taken from that individual. The scholars considered that prayer to be forbidden. Okay. Well, we'll get into the thing about the validity in a moment, and they consider that the prayer is inseparable from that land which is illegally seized. And I'll give you another example. And as I mentioned, I concur that the example is weak, but this is what I found in the books. One which is separable from the act, they say, like wearing silk while praying. So you're at work, excuse me, you're at work and you have a tie on and you have a silk tie, okay? Comes time for prayer, so you're wearing silk while you're praying. Who has a question? Somebody raise their hand. Yes, brother. Yeah, okay, that would come under like the separable to the act. we're going to come to that, about the validity. Okay. Now, a term which is important, and we'll be discussing that when we come into, remember when we talked about the Sharia law, we said it's either demand or an option or declaration. So we're sort of jumping ahead of ourselves. But one of the declarations is something which is known as facet. Alright, facet. In Arabic it's written like this. And it means that something becomes null and void. So if it's referring to an act of worship, it means that you have not done that act of worship and you're still responsible before Allah to perform that act of worship. We'll discuss this, of course, in greater detail a little bit later in the course. With regard to contract, it means the contract is not valid, and so therefore the resultant effect of that contract is not enforced. So, for instance, a contract of buying and selling. I sell you something. I sell you something for, let's say, I sell you a car, okay, and the car has a hidden defect, right? The brakes don't work in it. All right. If you ever know any car salesmen, they do stuff like that. And what happens is that contract, since it has some sort of cheating in it, right? The contract, according to the Sharia, if you were unaware that it had a hidden defect, is facet. It's null and void. Okay? And so therefore, when an act, okay, is forbidden due to itself, it renders that act or that contract null and void, facet. Okay? When an act, the forbidden aspect of it, is due to a quality in itself, it renders that act facet, null and void. When an act is facet in reference to something else, and that matter is inseparable from the act, it renders that act null and void or facet. However, though, when the act is forbidden in reference to something else which is separable to the act, it does not render that act null and void, and so therefore the act is still valid, or the contract is still valid. Okay? So, the brother asked a question, what happens if somebody prays with a stolen garment? He goes out there, and they're selling some, jackets, he knows that it's stolen, they're selling it at a cheaper price because it's on the street, some stolen goods, and he puts it on, he does his prayer in it, okay? According to the scholars, that is something which is forbidden, it's a forbidden garment, right? But it is separable to the act of prayer. That does not render the prayer, right, null and void. Okay? Because, No, because the land, they consider it, and I concur, the example that they give is weak, but they consider it, according to the school which I took some of this notes from, legal school, which is a Hanbali school, they consider it to be void, the prayer, and they put this as an example of something which is inseparable to the act. Let us think of another example. Somebody makes wudu using a cup, okay, made of gold. Is his wudu lawful? Is his wudu valid? Why? Right, it's separable from the act. I mean, even though it's forbidden to use gold, okay, instruments, or silver at the same time, since it's separable from the act, it becomes valid. All right, somebody prays in a bathroom. Does that make the act of prayer valid? Huh? Yeah, a toilet. Why is it valid? Okay. What do you think? It's not separable, according to the Hanbalis. Okay? Because they use this as the example, okay? But according to the Maliki, Shafi'i, and the Hanafis, they consider it as separable to the act. Alright, and they consider it to be valid. Okay, that's basically what I want to say about haram. Any questions, anybody? Yes. Over here. Yes. Whether would it extend to, you mean land that you bought using a mortgage and so forth? I don't know, that's a very good question. But the example that the Hanbali scholars use is for the land which is illegally seized, and also praying on a land which has been forbidden by the text of the Sharia, like the Prophet forbade us to pray in bathrooms, places where camels congregate, also to pray in graveyards and so forth. They use these as the examples. As far as land which is purchased using some sort of illegal means of purchasing like usury. Would that fall into that? Allah knows best. Let me make a note, and inshallah ta'ala, if I can find some answer in the library, I'll tell you. I think this is the first time.
One intends to do haram deeds, but for some reason he does not do it. So by the definition, he's not justified. Yeah? He's not justified.
Okay, if a person intends to do a haram deed, something which is forbidden, and his heart is firm and set upon it, but Allah prevents him from completing the act, then he has sinned. And let me give you an example. You intend to shoot somebody. You put your bullets in the gun, you cock the barrel, right? You aim, okay, but you miss. You didn't kill him, but you still committed a sin. Alright, or somebody comes by and you get scared, so you hide the gun and you walk away. You still have sinned. Okay? As opposed to a person who, when he thinks, he says, well, I'd like to do this, and then he, dispels that thought. He doesn't receive a sin for that. So it's the difference if your heart becomes firm and resolute upon committing that act, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not permit you to commit that act because the circumstances do not allow you to fulfill that act. There you have sinned. As opposed to a person having a thought pass, in his mind that to do something which is forbidden, and yet he then discards that thought, and so therefore he doesn't sin. I think this part of this. Separable to the act and inseparable to the act. Well, unfortunately, as I mentioned, the example wasn't very good, but what they meant was that the act of worship or the contract, that matter was essential to it in the sense that there is no way that contract can be fulfilled or that act of worship can be fulfilled without that being part of it. And that becomes inseparable. Otherwise, it's considered separable. I'll try to see if I can look at some other books and find a better example. No, he can, and that's why I'm saying the example is weak, But that's what they use. So I couldn't find another example. So I concur that it's a weak example. We have one question over here.
The first one refers to shirk.
Yes.
Does that cover the forms, the types, and things like that, or is it the sort of situation at the sort of highest step where people worshiping idols, things like that, or does that cover everything?
Good question. It covers all forms of shirk, both the major shirk, when you're worshipping a deity besides Allah, or the lesser shirk when you do an act of worship seeking some sort of praise or some sort of worldly benefit. Any act of worship which has an element of shirk, whether the object of worship is another deity besides Allah, or you're worshipping Allah but you're doing it for some sort of praise or worldly benefit, that act of worship is therefore fasid, null and void. And so therefore you have to redo it. No, they wouldn't get the same punishment if they haven't killed them yet. Okay. I think we've come to the end of this session. No? Am I correct? So do you want to go for just 5 more minutes? All right. All right, let's just take makruh so we can end the demand, and we'll be just a couple minutes, and then we'll take a break. Okay, the acts of commission we said, like the acts of omission we said, like the acts of commission, are those which are absolute, and those which are recommended. So when the Sharia recommends for us to leave an act, it is known as makruh. And the only real issue that we have regarding the makruh is that we want to know its definition. That's about the only thing which I want to discuss. And that it is defined as that act, or that demand, we can say, just to try to keep our definitions consistent, to that recommended demand, recommended demand, to forsake an act, and the person is rewarded if he forsakes the act and he is not under the threat of punishment if he performs that act. Okay, so the makruh is the opposite of what demand we discussed earlier? Not the haram, the mandub. Okay, because the mandub, right, or the recommended, was a recommended demand to do an act. If you did it, you would be rewarded, but if you left it, you would not be under the threat of punishment. And the makruh is just the exact opposite. If you forsake it, you are rewarded, but if you commit it, you are not under the threat of punishment. And likewise, the makruh can also, with regards to the forbidden, can also be thought of in the same analogy, where the makruh are those acts which approach the forbidden. And so by hanging around in here, right, in the circle of the disliked acts, okay, because makruh being translated as disliked, or blameworthy, by, being in this circle of the dislike, the blameworthy, right, one draws himself closer to the haram. And the chance of him then falling into that which has been forbidden by Allah is, right, greater. But if one is outside of the circle of the dislike, or let's say this is a greater circle, means this is the permissible, and so therefore it includes both the obligatory, the recommended, and what we'll do the next class, the mubah, or the optional. By one remaining over here, he's further away from the haram. Okay? But once you've made a motion towards the makruh, you've made a motion towards the haram. And it's more likely then for you to fall into that which Allah has forbidden, and thereby incurring sin and being under the threat of divine punishment on the day of judgment. Yes, brother.
An example of makruh, please.
An example of makruh? Okay, one example given by the scholars is to stand and drink, to eat standing. Okay, these are examples the scholars give to makruh. We will later on, we'll have a section in the course regarding divine commands and divine prohibitions, and we'll discuss some of the means, inshallah ta'ala, by which you can distinguish whether an act prohibited is prohibited in the sense of it being forbidden, or prohibited in the sense of being makruh, and if something is commanded, is it commanded in the sense of being obligatory, or commanded in the sense of being recommended. We'll discuss some of those matters. Okay, I think we should break here, and we'll come back, I guess, at the next class, maybe half an hour, I guess, something like that.